come over to this side of the room to give a bit of a contrast, but I don't actually have overhead slides. And I'm going to really present today in the context of my own, obviously, experience as a public lawyer, someone who is vitally interested in the ways in which our institutions have been set up to manage power in society, and to think of these questions that this conference is raising for us in terms of adjusting to a new world, adjusting to a new future, with a commitment to a very basic sense of citizenship. So citizenship really is the theme, but not only in the formal legal sense, which is causing a lot of politicians a lot of heartache at the moment, and I'm actually going to come back to that because it grounds quite closely with some of the themes that Peter has raised, but also in terms of the notion of active citizenship and how we as individuals, I think, have to reconfigure our notion of what it means to be an active citizen in a democratic framework with Western liberal democratic values underpinning it, at the same time as recognising that society is changing. And if you walk away and try to remember, or for the person who's drawing up at the back that I can see, there are three themes to the message that I'm wanting to contribute to our discussion. One is that our own view of the world, our own view of where a democratic frame should fit, is fundamentally influenced by our own life experience. It's a pretty basic notion, but often we don't stop and actually think about how we're each interpreting what is happening all around us by virtue of our own life experience, and how you're all listening to what I'm having to say now is going to be actually quite different. If you walked out of the room, this is a sort of basic evidence class, if you walk out of the room and report back what you've heard in my 10 minutes, you'll have different memories, that even though there is a factual reality in terms of, well, I don't actually have a paper, but if I did, that there'd be a factual representation, the message that would stay with you would be coming from your own life experience. And that is pretty fundamental to notions of representation and how we manage in a democratic community our needs and how we negotiate those needs to live civilly and in harmony. So that's theme one. The second theme is the exercise of power. Now, power is something that is obviously central to constitutional law, to a legal system, and how we balance the ways in which each of us as individuals, but more broadly as a community, manage that power. So democracy obviously is a frame for managing power, and within our Australian democratic system, consistent with other Western liberal systems, there are basic principles in terms of institutional power. In fact, the entire Australian Constitution was framed over the essentially tussle between what was going to become the Commonwealth government, the federal government, and state governments. And the central aspect, as Tanya and Rufus will remember from when we were studying constitutional law, is about the allocation of power between the federal government and the state governments. And what went on in developing that was coming from the lived experience of the colonists at the time and what Australian society represented at that particular period in time, which was a society that was highly based on very different norms to today. And I will come back to that in terms of explaining how this links in, I think, quite strongly to some of Peter's points. But in essence, that's the second theme about power and how we manage power. But importantly, institutional power is only one aspect of it. The other is our interpersonal notions of power. And I think that that needs to be grounded by a much more transparent consciousness of the fact that our own lived experiences are going to be different, and we have to be more respectful of other people's ways into relationships that perhaps hasn't been concentrated on enough in our current society, and has been seen through the tensions that we've seen through various abuses in institutional frameworks, but also in employer frameworks and in interpersonal relationships in terms of domestic violence and broader issues. They all revolve around the notion of power. So that's the second point. And then the third point in relation to a theme is this notion of active citizenship. So in Australia, I've written a lot about the notion of citizenship as a legal status. But when we think of citizenship It's not only the politicians who have to be worrying about how many citizenships they hold, but legal status leads on to certain rights and responsibilities and access to those rights and responsibilities. And often rights talk is a broader notion than citizenship as a status. We think in a community that individuals, persons, have access to certain rights and that their formal legal status in terms of their relationship to the state shouldn't impact on some basic social and economic rights, the sorts of issues that Peter was talking about in terms of access to an economic form of equality, but not dependent on your formal legal status. Although some societies do actually differentiate, and that's why sometimes there is a greater struggle. But in addition to that, there is the notion of political participation. Now, often that can be linked directly to citizens in terms of the formal status, but often in terms of local communities, it's not to do with a formal status, but it is a sense of being a co-participant, and so that individuals within local councils, for instance, in your local government, don't have to be citizens to vote. You have to be a ratepayer. It's another form of connection that is actually given status for the purposes of having an influence in a traditional democratic sense of voting. But the other is a notion of identity and participation. And I think this is the key notion around which we're going to see significant changes and positive changes by virtue of the disruptions that Peter has been talking about in terms of societal equality and the growing divide between the haves and have-nots. And that is, again, linking back to the first theme, about a recognition that all of us as individuals have a stake in what is happening to us in our common society, however that is defined, whether it's more directly local in terms of our life experience that may be connecting more to individuals who are literally in the neighbourhood, or whether you are someone who is entirely engaged in a globalised world with international issues on the international stage, and so have access to participating and influencing the public discourse on an international plane. And so that leads me to the link in my last 7 minutes, the link to what Peter has introduced in terms of this growing divide and change in the way individuals feel connected to society. And Peter used the significant changes that look to occur in terms of access to work because of the changed technological environments that we are looking forward to. So rather than feeling fearful, which may be one of the consequences when you're not sure what change will be, I honestly believe that this is a moment of positive opportunity in terms of rethinking the way we as a society revolve around work. Because one of the fundamental realities, if we go back to the lived experience of all of us in the room and of notions of power in society, is that all of us have experienced the importance or the value of work by virtue of our experience growing up, wherever that's been, whether it started off in England or started off in another country or here in Australia in a Western liberal sense. Perhaps we might see differences. But work being core to status and to access to economic consequences. And that has had an impact in terms of societal norms. So in the sense of what is deemed to be the good citizen or the active citizen has often been linked also not to voting, but your contribution through work. But work has often been very much in the public and the private domain. And it's the public domain that's been given much more value and seen as more central than the private domain. Now, the private domain of work is largely about caring. Now, traditionally, women have been most responsible for the caring responsibilities, so that private work in the home, was never given as much value as public work. And a lot of my work in terms of gender and active citizenship has concentrated on the significance of public activity of women in the public space. And I'm very committed in terms of a changed democracy, of that change in democracy enabling the different life experiences, not only in terms of gender, although that's a significant aspect, but other other aspects in our participatory democracy that need more amplification and access to decision-making. And all of the changes that Peter referred to before in terms of changed opportunities for technology are, of course, very enabling, because you don't have to necessarily be in the public sphere to be able to voice your response to different legislative, political issues. But I think one of the other significant changes by virtue of this disruption is to actually look back into society and see that there are so many aspects of caring work that hasn't been valued that in some ways should be mandated to be the responsibility of all active citizens. Now, Jennifer Nedelsky, who is a legal philosopher at the University of Toronto, is about to publish a book which is about changing our attitudes to the role of care in society as a way of enabling a more egalitarian society. That is, that each of us would be responsible and committed by virtue of some government decree, and we can work out how this would actually work, to commit to a certain number of caring hours per week. No matter if you are the chief executive of a multi-million, billion-dollar company or otherwise, that each of us have a minimum responsibility for caring. Now, caring, of course, is identifiable very quickly in terms of our own familial relationships, but is broader than that. So that could be one aspect. But another aspect could be in terms of those beyond our family needs of caring in society that need support and attention. All of the jobs that tend to be contracted out should actually be taken on board by everybody. Which links back to my first 2 points, because if our life experiences are amplified to build into our responsibilities as human beings, caring for other people in some shape or form, and that we actually experience it as opposed to contract it out, that will amplify our humanity, but it will also amplify our sense of how laws play out on individuals, because you have a better sense from your life experience. But I think it will also fundamentally alter the balance of power in society to recognise that all human beings have responsibilities to one another, and that will play out in a democratic sense in the way that we reconfigure some of these fundamental changes that are happening. And to me, they're all parts of a broader framework of rethinking active citizenship in a new world. It's not just rethinking citizenship, which I personally believe we should in terms of Section 44 of the Constitution, and saying that people have more than one connection with a nation state without that undermining their loyalty or commitment to the country that they're in Parliament for, but about actually recognising fluidity in our identity, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of our responsibilities and life experiences that amplify, which, in my view, will lead to a better connected society more broadly, but I think will be fundamental to the changing ways in which we engage with the technological opportunities that the new framework may empower us to be involved as active citizens in a new democratic frame. Thank you.